Alrighty, in this video I'm going to show you how to do this, which is basically create a grid layout on your website so that you can lay things out in different sections, whatever rows or columns you'd like. Here I show you an example where I've labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I colored each area just so that you can see where things are. And these are the grid lines. So the grid lines are labeled in this. This is Firefox that I'm using, which labels its grid lines. So the very top line is 1, 2, 3, and between 1 and 2 is this track, which is called row 1. Between 2 and 3 is this track, which is called row 2. Same thing with the columns. Columns are labeled from the very left, the line 1, line 2, line 3, and line 4. The first column or track is called column 1, and that is between lines 1 and 2. Column 2 is between lines 2 and 3. Column 3 is between lines 3 and 4. And so that's how a grid layout works. It's important for you to create your layout beforehand on a piece of paper before you start organizing things. Otherwise, all these numbers that we're showing here will be meaningless to you if you don't understand where you're putting things and how these lines are actually numbered. Each of these represent the different lines. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to create a basic grid layout. I've created a new replet, and the title here that I've changed this to is Grid Layout Example. I've deleted all the JavaScript stuff because we're not dealing with JavaScript here. But what I'm going to start off with is some div layers in my HTML. So I'm in my index.html file, and I'm going to create a set of divs. Oops. This is not working very well. Oh, it's not tabbing right. Hang on. Let's do that. Okay. So now I've got a set of divs, and this set of divs, I'm going to call this a class. I'm going to name this container. You can call it whatever you want, just remember what you called it. Okay, so this container is going to contain my grid layout. So if you want your entire website to be grid layout, then please do surround everything in the body with that container class, and you should be good to go. So like I said before, make sure that you have your grid all planned out on a piece of paper. You've labeled all your lines, labeling all the row lines from 1 at the very top all the way to whatever you want. All the column lines from 1 at the very left to whatever you want on the right. And then for each of these sections, make sure you create divs. So this one div class container surrounds everything, and then for each div is going to represent a different cell in your table. So basically you can think of a grid layout as a table just like you would have in Word, and that makes it easier for you to arrange where certain images go, certain menus, certain pieces of content, etc. So I've got this container class, container div surrounding everything, and then within that I'm going to create a table just like I showed in the very beginning where there are 2 rows and 3 columns. So that's a total of 6 different sections if you want. It doesn't have to be 6 sections. You can have your div stretch across a certain number of lines, but in this case I'm going to create 6 sections, and then we'll modify it. Okay, so because there are going to be 6 sections, I'm going to create 6 div boxes. So the first one I'm going to call box 1. second one box 2, and then I'm going to keep going. So what did I say? There's 6 different boxes. And if this gets tiring, you can actually just copy and paste. Actually, I should have been doing that. Just copy all of this, paste. Just have to make sure all the spacing's correct. So 5, 6, and then make sure I name the boxes correctly. 5, 6. So here are my 6 boxes. So for each one, I'm going to put some content in it. I'm just going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Of course, in actuality, you would put an image tag in there, a link, or whatever it is, or a whole navigation menu, if you will. Okay, it all depends on what you want to put in there, and then you would adjust the size in the CSS. Okay, so this is the structure in the HTML, basically a whole container surrounding all of these smaller boxes. And the reason for the container is because that's going to be our grid, and then each one of these boxes is going to be a separate box on our grid. So now we're going to go to our CSS. And here I'm going to start with container dot container. The dot means that you're trying to define a class here. And then I'm going to define this class. First, I'm going to say display : grid. So this in the CSS tells your web browser that this whole thing is going to be a grid layout. And typically nowadays people use grid layout, and then within each of the grids they would have a flexbox or other types of layout. But it's good to start off with a grid, and that way you can have everything in its own place, and then also it's responsive as well. So whether you use a mobile phone or an iPad or large computer screen, it doesn't matter. It'll resize itself. So it's actually quite nice to do layout with grid. Okay, so display grid, and then we're going to define our grid template. So we're going to define 2 things, the column and the row. So let's start with columns. So grid template columns. This is where you have to do a bit of thinking, because we have 3 columns. How big do you want each column to be? Remember, columns are the vertical sections, so up and down. So maybe my first column I want to have it as like 100 pixels wide. My second column I want it 500 pixels wide, and third column 100 pixels wide. Okay. You always end all of these with a semicolon, so don't forget that. Next thing, grid template rows. If you don't type in the rows, it'll automatically create the rows for you. So if you have 6 boxes like we did in the HTML, it'll fill up the first row, because we only made 3 columns, so it's going to fill up the first row, 1, 2, 3, and then there'll be 3 left, so it's going to make a new row. But we want to be more explicit, and what that means is I want to control what happens in the end. So I'm going to follow exactly the outline that I have, or the plan that I had in the very beginning, which is I'm going to have 6 boxes, 2 rows, 3 columns. So how many rows am I going to have? I said I'm going to have 2 rows. So this defines the size of each row. So the top row, I'm going to make it 100 pixels. We can change this later. And the second one, I'm going to make slightly bigger, and let's make it 200 pixels. Okay, so that is my entire grid. So the reason why that's my entire grid is because this is the container, and you can see in the HTML that corresponds to this class, and this class is the div that surrounded the entire grid. Okay, so let's go and define each box now. So box 1, I'm going to go grid column. So now you have to kind of look at the diagram that you had, and if you go back to the beginning of this video, I had it all laid out where all the numbers of the rows and columns are there. So since this is box 1, it's going to start with line number 1 and end at line number 2 for the first column. So box 1 is grid line 1 to 2. That's the first column. For the grid row, it is also 1 to 2 because this box is in the top left corner of my grid. Box 2, I have to keep track of things on here. It's easier if you have a piece of paper with your design in front of you. So this will be from column 2 to 3, but it's still going to be in the first row. Well, at least that's where I want this one. And you can put these anywhere you want. Just make sure you know where you're putting things and what you're doing. So this is still going to be in the top row, so it's still from line 1 to 2. But it is in the second column, so it's from line 2 to 3. Remember, the grid lines are different from the column numbers. So the grid lines are what surround each column. The grid lines are what surround each row. So you're defining here that column is between those two grid lines. The row here is between the first and second grid line. Box 3. And this will be our third and last column, so it's going to be from line 3 to 4. But it's still going to be on our top row, so lines 1 to 2. Now we get into our second row. So this starts changing now. For box 4, you're going to have a grid column. You're going to start over because box 4 is right below box 1. So the grid column is back to 1 between 1 and 2. The grid row is the second row, so it's between 2 and 3. Box 5. Grid column 2 to 3. Grid row also 2 to 3. Because this is second row, second column. And then finally, the last box, bottom right corner of our grid. Grid column 3 to 4. Grid row, it's in the second row, so it's going to be line 2 to 3. All right. Oh, this should be box 6. All right. So now, if I take a look at this in Firefox here, I'm going to reload the page. I can see I've got a grid here. It's hard to see where things are though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, well, there's two things I can do. If you're in Firefox, Firefox actually comes with some nice tools here. You can go to the web developer tools, and there's something called, let's just toggle tools. And then down here you'll see div container, and then you can display the line numbers, which is nice. Display area names, extend lines indefinitely. Okay, so there's our grid. So you can see, let's just go back through all of these. the section that we named box 1 with the word 1 in it, that's this one here. You can kind of see the word 1 in it. It's just because these line numbers are obscuring it. But if you go to the CSS, that corresponds to this piece of the CSS here. So for box 1, we went from grid column line 1, which is this line here, to grid column line 2, which is this line here. So that's box 1. Box 1 is also from grid row 1, which is up here, to grid line 2. So that tells the browser that box 1 is this whole area right here. Okay? Let's do another example. Let's look at box 5. Box 5. You can see in the HTML the word 5 is in box 5, and here's your class, and this is the corresponding CSS element here. So it's grid column 2 to 3, so it's from 2 to 3, and grid row 2 to 3, here's grid row 2 to 3. So that means this box is right in this spot right here. You see negative numbers as well, and you can use negative numbers for grid lines, but we didn't do that here. Sometimes it comes in handy for different things, but we're not going to talk about it right now. Okay, another way to make this more visual is just to change the colors. So if you add colors, then if you're not in Firefox, you won't see the grid lines, unfortunately, in Chrome. They don't have those kinds of tools. So one way to just make sure things are in the right place or the right size is to go background color. Let's add a red color to box 1. Maybe I should just copy these. Let's just copy these. Control C, and this one's going to be green. Oops, what did I do? Okay, oopsie, I messed up. Okay, green, and then let's make this one blue, and let's make this one orange. This one can be purple, and this one can be, let's make this one pink. Okay, so if I color all those in, and let's make the text show up well as well, and let's make the font color white for the entire container. So now if we reload this, there you can see colorful boxes. Okay, so there we go. That's how you do grid layout. Now if we wanted to change the sizes of any of these things, we can. Just go back to the container, and you can see the first column is 100, second column is 500, and the third column is 100. You can totally modify these. What if the first column, you want the first column to be wider? Change it to 700 pixels. You can see that first column is much wider now. Another way to go about doing this is to go 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, and an FR basically tells it to evenly divide it so that relative to each other, this is one piece of the whole pie, sort of. So let's say you want the second column to be double, though, then you can go 2 FR and it'll automatically adjust like that. And the cool thing is with grid layout is that it's responsive, which means that I could change the size of this window and it'll adjust itself to maintain the 1, 2, and 1 ratios. Okay, so you can see it happening there. Let me get this back. Okay, another way you could do this is to use repeat. So you can go a repeat The first number in repeat is how many times you want to repeat it. We have 3 columns, so I'm going to go 3. And if I go 1FR, then it's going to repeat 1FR 3 times. So that's just like saying 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. This is not necessarily less typing. As you can see here, if I typed 1FR, 1FR, that's actually less typing than repeat. But there are some times when you have to repeat a lot of columns. Say you have 100 columns, right? You're not going to type 1FR 100 times. You can just go repeat 100 times 1FR, and that'll give you 100 columns. You can't see all the columns here because I never created boxes for those columns. So it's still using these columns and rows that I have defined here already. Okay? So let me change this back to 3 times 1FR, and there. Same thing with the rows. Let's say the second row, I want to make it much bigger. I could go 400 pixels. Okay. Maybe the first row I want to make it even less. Let's make this 70 pixels. So it's thinner, right? But also same thing, I can go 1FR, 1FR, or do the repeat. And you'll see it fractionally, it'll be the same. Of course, if for height, it becomes a little bit different because if you actually want it to stretch out, right now it's just stretching out to the size of the content that's in there. So it automatically resize. So in order to get it to a certain size, you can use something called min-max. So min-max, you can go min-max, and the minimum size I want is 100 pixels, and the maximum size is auto, or you can write in how many pixels you want. So that is for the first row, and right now the second one is just the default like that. For the second row, you can say, okay, I want the second row to be 700 pixels. Okay, so you can feel free to mix and match different designations for how big you want these rows to be, how tall you want these rows to be. Okay, now how do you stretch across more than the column? Let's say box 1, you want to stretch across between 1 and 2. So obviously that would negate box 2 because it'll just cover it up. But to do that, you just change the line number. So you say you want it to stretch from grid line 1. Let's see if I can get the grid lines. There we go. Say I want to stretch from, for box 1, I want to stretch from line 1 to line 3. I would just change this to 3. And you can see what happens. I think this is interfering with it because it's got a higher Z number, so it's on the top. Let's see what we'll do. We can get rid of box 2 here, or let's just comment it out. We'll just go like this. This will comment out box 2, and then put a // so this box 2 is gone. Okay, and now you can see box 1 stretches across from grid line 1 to 3. 1 to 3. We do the same thing with the rows. We can go, okay, I want this to stretch from 1 to 3. Let's see what happens. And of course 4 and 5 are interfering with it. So if you really want to do that, you wouldn't create a box 4 and 5. So let's just comment that one out. Let's get rid of 4 and 5 by making this into a comment. And so this is a comment in CSS. So it'll basically say, don't read this. Okay, so now that's gone. And we have grid row stretching from 1 to 3. So just to show you the lines again, box 1 now stretches from column line 1 to 3. So first two columns are taken over. Box 1 takes over the rows from line 1 to the very bottom one, which is 3. So 1 to 3. So that's why if you go 1 to 3, 1 to 3, you can make it stretch across. Okay, so those are the basics of grid layout. So with grid layout, you can put things wherever you want to. Of course, for real content to go in here, you would do more than in the HTML put 1, 2, 3. You would put an image here, maybe a menu here, or maybe some content in this one. But the important thing is to draw out on a piece of paper all these grid lines and where do you want things to go, and then decide how you want to define all these different boxes. That's it.